NATO produces risk, not security, for Türkiye. Gürdeniz.
Throughout the Cold War, Turkey was a flank country protecting NATO's southern flank. Today, however, there is a Turkey that is encircled from the south and forced into confrontation with Russia to its north and Iran to its east. The NATO summit to be held in Ankara on July 7-8, 2026 is an ordinary summit for NATO, but a summit of historic importance for Turkey. This is because NATO has not changed. What has changed is the balance of power in the world, Turkey's geopolitics, and its elements of national power. Throughout the Cold War, NATO was a balancing alliance that encircled the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, however, as seen in the examples of Yugoslavia, Libya, and Ukraine, it became the military instrument of American geopolitics in Europe. By contrast, the new balance of power formed today by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea is ending the absolute superiority of the Atlantic system. Turkey has achieved significant gains in the modernization and standardization of its armed forces and in the development of its defense industry. Today, it has reached a level at which it can develop its own defense industry to a large extent independently. Yet despite this accumulation of strength, Ankara has not been able to fully resist NATO's impositions in recent years. The Libya intervention, the practices during the Ukraine war, and what happened through the Kurajik radar station during the Iran-Israel crisis show a clear difference between rhetoric and actual practice. The Ankara summit is being held in precisely such an environment. Turkey is forced Westernism. The founding philosophy of the Republic saw Westernization as a means of modernization, but it never embraced strategic dependence on the West. Ataturk's understanding of foreign policy was based on full independence, balanced politics, and staying away from military alliances.
However, in the process that began in 1939, Turkey was gradually integrated into the Atlantic security system, and Westernization turned over time into Westernism. NATO, however, is not merely a military alliance. It is the security apparatus of roughly 500 years of collective Western geopolitics. In the historical process extending from colonialism to imperialism, it has constantly needed a common threat in order to sustain its existence. Yesterday, the Soviet Union and communism played this role. Today, Russia, China, and Iran perform the same function. The enemies have changed, but NATO's strategic logic has not. For this reason, the thesis that NATO was established only as a defense organization against the Soviet threat is incomplete. NATO is the institutional backbone that sustains the United States military and political leadership over Europe. After the Cold War, Israel's security also gradually became an inseparable part of the Atlantic system, and the link between NATO's strategic orientation and Israel's security grew even stronger. Today, the fact that Israel's government openly defines Turkey as a threat and that sanctions and pressure initiatives against Turkey are increasing in the U.S. Congress are important indicators of the geopolitical axis along which NATO will move in the future. Despite this, NATO is still not seriously questioned in Turkey. While public opposition to the United States and Israel has reached historic levels, the similar reflexes of the government and the main opposition on NATO show that there is a clear foreign policy divide between the people and the political elites. Yet Turkey today stands at the very center of NATO's new geopolitical encirclement line against Russia, Iran, and China. For this reason, the Ankara summit may be a routine meeting for NATO.
But for Turkey, the real issue that must be discussed is not whether NATO provides security, but whether it is turning Turkey into a forward outpost of U.S., Israel-centered Atlantic geopolitics and a frontline country in future conflicts. NATO's reason for existence, a permanent enemy. After the Second World War, Europe was divided between American and Soviet spheres of influence. During this period, NATO took shape not only as a defense alliance encircling the Soviet Union, but also as the institutional backbone of the American-led Atlantic Order. Washington's aim was, on the one hand, to encircle the Soviets, and on the other, to prevent the emergence in Western Europe, especially in Germany, of a military and geopolitical power center independent of the United States. NATO's existence depended as much on a continuous perception of a common threat as on its military capabilities. Throughout the Cold War, this threat was the Soviet Union. Through NATO, the United States continued the strategy it had inherited from Britain, command of the seas and keeping Eurasia fragmented. Thanks to the petrodollar system, its military superiority, and Europe's security dependence on it, the United States both encircled the Soviets and channeled Europe's economic power into financing its own global leadership. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1991, NATO might have been expected to complete its historical mission. Instead, however, the alliance produced new threats and new areas of mission. The breakup of Yugoslavia, the interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and finally the Ukraine war became milestones of this transformation. Today, for NATO, Russia is not merely a military rival, it is the main element that keeps the alliance's institutional legitimacy alive.
A lasting Russia-West peace would call into question not only Europe's security architecture, but also NATO's enlargement policy, defense expenditures, and the very rationale for the Atlantic system's existence. For this reason, the Ukraine war is not only about encircling Russia, it also serves the functions of keeping Europe dependent on the United States, limiting China's rise in Eurasia, and preventing the integration of power centers outside the Atlantic system. The demand that NATO members raise their defense expenditures to 5% of national income is also a natural consequence of this strategy. The United States and the EU are clinging more tightly to NATO amid a process of decline. The main reason NATO has taken on a more aggressive character today is not that Russia has grown stronger, but that the Atlantic system has become relatively weaker. The United States has lost a significant portion of its production power to China and is facing problems of high debt, financialization, and social polarization. The European Union, meanwhile, is experiencing one of the most fragile periods in its history because of low growth, an energy crisis, demographic decline, and political fragmentation. Throughout history, great powers in decline have behaved more aggressively abroad as they have weakened at home and have demanded greater military and economic sacrifices from their allies. Washington's pressure on NATO countries to arm themselves more heavily and its making Europe more dependent on the American defense industry and energy resources are the present-day reflection of this approach. Even if Trump's priorities change, it is not possible for the United States to abandon Europe's security architecture or Israel's security. For this reason, NATO is no longer merely a military alliance encircling Russia, it has become the main instrument that prolongs the economic, political, and geopolitical life of the Atlantic system.
In this process, the perception of a constant threat is becoming normalized in Western societies. The Ukraine war, Europe's rapid rearmament, and the narrowing of freedoms on security grounds are indicators of this. NATO's most important source of legitimacy is the Russian threat. If this threat weakens, not only NATO, but also the rationale for the Atlantic security architecture will be questioned. It is also not realistic for Europe to separate strategically from the United States in the short term. This is because Europe remains dependent on Washington for critical military capabilities, such as nuclear deterrence, strategic airlift, missile defense, satellite intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance, and joint operational planning. For this reason, Europe today, as in the past during both world wars, acts on the assumption that its security will ultimately be provided by the United States. Why did Turkey join NATO? Churchill's statement, "Bringing an allied force onto the battlefield is as valuable as a war-winning maneuver," summarizes the alliance mentality of great powers. With the start of the Cold War, one of Washington's main objectives was to include Turkey in the Atlantic security system and prevent it from remaining neutral in a possible US-Soviet war. NATO's purpose was not only to encircle the Soviets, but also to restructure Western Europe under the American security umbrella and bring the Western Peninsula of Eurasia under Washington's geopolitical control. Turkey was the key country in this strategy. Because it controlled the Straits and stood at the intersection of the Balkans, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean, it was indispensable from Washington's perspective. The main reason for Turkey's admission to NATO was not Turkish security, but the needs of American geopolitics. Indeed, although the U.S.
Joint Chiefs of Staff's Griddle Plan of August 15, 1946 showed that there was no concrete intelligence indicating that the Soviets were preparing to invade Turkey, it nevertheless envisioned keeping the Soviet threat politically alive. In 1948, General McBride, head of the U.S. Joint Military Aid Mission to Turkey, also openly stated that the purpose of military aid was not so much to stop the Soviets as to inflict the highest possible losses on them if Turkey were occupied. From Washington's perspective, the real goal was not to protect Turkey, but to prevent it from remaining neutral in a major war. To achieve this goal, scenarios in which the Soviets would invade Turkey were spread through the narrative of the West and the Westernizers within our own country, and those who had come to occupy Turkey in 1919 now appeared as saviors.
In his comprehensive study, 1945, Turkey-USSR Relations, Kermes-Ketty Publishing, 2021, based on Soviet archives, researcher and writer Hazal Yalan substantially questions the narrative of an approaching Soviet invasion, which for many years was accepted in Turkey as an absolute truth. According to Yalan, Stalin's main priority was not to invade Turkey, but to change the Straits regime in his own favor within the framework of Black Sea security, and to ensure that Turkey remained a neutral neighbor, even if not anti-Western. However, Foreign Minister Molotov's diplomatic mistakes, the proposal for the joint defense of the Straits, statements reopening the discussion of the 1921 borders, and territorial claims published in Pravda brought the fear of Russia and Ankara to its peak. Turkish decision-makers also used these developments as a strong justification for entering under the security umbrella of the United States and Britain.
As a result, the Soviet threat was perceived beyond its actual dimensions and became one of the most important psychological and geopolitical tools accelerating Turkey's turn toward the Atlantic system. When Turkey was admitted to NATO in 1952, Washington's most important gain was that Turkey largely lost the option of remaining neutral in a major war under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Thus, Turkey's unique geopolitics was effectively placed at the service of Atlantic strategy. However, this orientation did not begin in 1952. The first major deviation from the Republic's fully independent foreign policy line occurred with the alliance agreement signed with Britain and France in 1939. The approach based on Ataturk's balance policy was abandoned, and Turkey was gradually integrated into a Western-oriented security architecture. For this reason, NATO membership was not merely a military choice, it was also an important turning point in moving away from the understanding of strategic autonomy at the foundation of the Republic. Turkey's security map has changed. For 74 years, NATO created a multi-layered system that shaped not only Turkey's defense policies, but also its security bureaucracy, economic understanding, and strategic orientation. Today, however, Turkey's threat perception and NATO's threat perception no longer overlap. While NATO's priority is the encirclement of Russia, Turkey's main security problems are concentrated to its south. The initiatives against the Blue Homeland and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean, the military buildup in the Aegean, terrorist structures in northern Syria and Iraq, the U.S. presence in the region, and the new Israel-centered geopolitical equation are Turkey's priority security issues. The bipolar world of 1952 is now behind us. At that time, the defense industry was limited, and maritime geopolitics did not carry the weight it does today.
Today, however, thanks to its advanced defense industry, national missile and UAV/UCAV systems, powerful navy, Blue Homeland doctrine, energy corridors, and the new opportunities offered by the multipolar world, Turkey has a strategic position very different from that of the Cold War period. Turkey is no longer merely a front-line country protecting NATO's southeastern flank. It is a geopolitical center connecting the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Balkans, the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Turkic world, Africa, and the Red Sea. Despite this, attempts to shape its security strategy according to the 1952 understanding of us and the others are incompatible with changing geopolitical realities. Although Turkey has areas of competition with Russia and Iran, these two countries are its permanent neighbors. Turkey's interest is not to be dragged into war with them, but to manage competition and establish balance. By contrast, NATO's current strategic orientation carries the risk of pushing Turkey into confrontation with these countries. Therefore, the issue that must be discussed today is not whether NATO has changed. Since its establishment, NATO has largely operated with the same strategic logic. What has really changed is Turkey's geopolitics, its elements of national power, and its security needs. For this reason, Turkey's security map should no longer be the map drawn by NATO, but the national security map determined by its own geopolitics. The anti-Turkey attitude of NATO members. The true value of an alliance is measured by the solidarity it shows when one of its members faces a security threat. From this perspective, it is difficult to find strong examples showing that NATO or its leading members have stood by Ankara in the security problems Turkey has faced over the last 40 years. By contrast, on issues that directly concern Turkey's national security, such as PKK terrorism, the Syrian crisis, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Blue Homeland, many NATO member states have pursued policies contrary to Ankara's positions.
While political and legal space has been opened for the PKK in many NATO countries, some allies, especially the United States, have supported the YPG-PYD in Syria with thousands of truckloads of weapons and ammunition. After the July 15th coup attempt, the protection of FETO members in NATO countries, the refusal to extradite the organization's leaders, and the continuation of their activities also created a deep crisis of confidence for Türkiye. Similarly, Türkiye's exposure to SATSA sanctions and its removal from the F-35 program because of its S-400 purchase, the rapid arming of Greece, the transformation of Alexandroupoli into a major American logistics base, the lifting of the arms embargo on the Greek Cypriot administration of southern Cyprus, and support for the U.S., Israel, Greece, Greek Cypriot axis in the eastern Mediterranean all clearly show that NATO's leading members do not share Türkiye's security concerns. When these developments are considered together, it can be seen that a new geopolitical encirclement approach is taking shape along a line extending from the Aegean to the eastern Mediterranean and northern Syria, aimed at containing Türkiye. This approach is no longer covert. It has become an explicit state policy. Indeed, only 5 days before the NATO summit in Ankara, during a hearing at the U.S. House of Representatives Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Türkiye was described as occupying and expansionist. The TRNC and the Blue Homeland were directly targeted, and new calls for sanctions against Türkiye were made. Similar assessments are also found in U.S. and Israel-centered think tanks.
Turkey's search for strategic autonomy, its orientation toward a multipolar world, and its Blue Homeland approach are presented as threats to Western interests. Likewise, while Greece uses NATO effectively in line with its own national interests, it is trying to limit Turkey's position within the alliance. All of this makes it necessary to question what political legitimacy an alliance has to drag Turkey into a war in line with its own strategic priorities when that same alliance leaves Turkey alone on the PKK and YPG issues, shows no solidarity regarding FETO, does not support Turkey's rights and interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, and openly targets the Blue Homeland. While every state within NATO protects its own national interests to the maximum extent, Turkey showing the same strategic reflex is no longer a choice, but a requirement of national security. The magical Article 5, guarantee or strategic trap. NATO's most emphasized provision is Article 5, which regulates collective defense. However, in international relations, no security guarantee is absolute. Especially in asymmetric alliances, the priorities of great powers and the national interests of other allies may not always overlap. For this reason, not only NATO's future, but also the reliability of Article 5 has been increasingly debated in Western strategic circles in recent years. The greatest risks of alliances are being left alone in a time of need and being dragged into an unwanted war. For Turkey, the real danger today is the second possibility. A fait accompli or a false flag operation that could emerge during a crisis centered on the Baltic, the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, or Iran could make Turkey part of a major conflict that has nothing to do with its national interests. In such a situation, Turkey may face the risk of becoming, against its own will, one of the frontline countries in a showdown among great powers.
Developments in recent years show that interests do not always overlap even within NATO. During the Trump era, Europe's security guarantee became a matter of bargaining. Higher defense spending was demanded from allies, and differing approaches emerged during the Iran-Israel crisis. These developments show that the alliance now acts more on calculations of power and cost than on shared values. For this reason, the main issue for Türkiye is not whether NATO will defend Türkiye when necessary. The real issue is whether Türkiye will be dragged to the front on behalf of NATO in a war that has nothing to do with its own national interests. This is now one of the most important security questions that must be debated in the second century of the Republic. Türkiye's soft underbelly, economic vulnerability. Today, Türkiye's greatest strategic weakness is its economic vulnerability. An economic structure based on external financing and hot money rather than production limits not only the economy, but also freedom of decision-making in foreign policy and security. The geopolitical room for maneuver of states whose economic sovereignty has weakened also narrows. For this reason, the NATO debate in Türkiye often becomes locked not around security, but around the economy. The government aims to maintain economic stability and its political power by preserving the flow of external financing, while the opposition aims to come to power by giving confidence to the same international financial circles. As a result, both political blocs lack the room for maneuver to discuss in all their dimensions the strategic risks NATO creates for Türkiye. Türkiye faces a historic choice. The first path is to maintain full alignment with the Atlantic system for the sake of short-term economic stability. This choice may limit economic fluctuations, but it narrows strategic autonomy and puts Türkiye under the pressure of crises that have nothing to do with its own national interests.
The second path is a transformation based on a production-oriented national economic approach that reduces economic dependence. More painful in the short term, but strengthening geopolitical independence in the long term. In the second century of the Republic, the fundamental issue is not only the economy, but the ability to establish the right balance between economic independence and geopolitical independence. Because the cost of economic independence may be heavy. However, the cost of geopolitical dependence is often paid with the sovereignty of nations and the blood of their children. Turkey's security requires a new strategic framework. Throughout the Cold War, Turkey was a flank country protecting NATO's southern flank. Today, however, there is a Turkey that is encircled from the south and forced into confrontation with Russia to its north and Iran to its east. In such a geopolitical environment, remaining within NATO's military chain of command is increasingly producing strategic dependence rather than security. In the second century of the Republic, Turkey's goal must not be to become someone else's frontline country, but to become the central state of its own geopolitics. For this reason, the issue that must be discussed is whether NATO membership, and especially remaining within the military command structure, serves national security. During the era of General de Gaulle, France withdrew from NATO's military command structure in 1966 and ended the system that automatically assigned its forces to NATO plans. For Turkey, the access of NATO bureaucracy and the C2ISR, Command, Control, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Structure, to national intelligence and critical military information, constitutes a security risk as important as false flag operations. The fact that FETÖ was able to seize the state's most secret military documents in the Ergenekon and Balyoz conspiracies, and that many fugitive FETÖ members have been protected in NATO countries after the coup attempt, are concrete examples of this risk. In addition, the American tactical nuclear weapons at Incirlik and the Kurajik X-band radar have the potential to make our country one of the priority targets in a future nuclear-based crisis that could occur outside Turkey as well. Turkey must reduce these risks, re-establish full sovereignty over the bases on its territory, and ensure that all military activities within the Turkish armed forces are carried out only under the supervision of national authorities. Turkey must be able to make decisions on war and peace solely according to its own national interests and must not become a party to an unwanted conflict through any fait accompli. In this respect, NATO's 2026 Ankara summit is a historic threshold at which not only NATO's future, but also Turkey's geopolitical future is being discussed. In the second century of the Republic, Turkey will either continue to be the forward outpost of others' security architecture, or it will return to Ataturk's understanding of full independence and build its own security architecture in line with its own national interests. Turkey's priority must be to fully regain through its own sovereign will the decision on war and peace. The cost of economic independence may be heavy, however, the cost of geopolitical dependence is always much heavier.